We talk about the hows of doing something so often that we actually end up neglecting the why. Okay, this is quite a bold statement to make, but I do believe that there are one set of best practices when it comes to photo editing. Hello photographer, welcome back to my channel. It's Belinda and this is where we talk all about photography, from inspiration to camera techniques to editing skills so that you could take better photos. As you can tell from this setup and my really nerdy pair of glasses, you can probably tell that this is going to be a photo editing tutorial. Well, I don't really want to call it a tutorial because it's not. We talk about the hows of doing something so often that we actually end up neglecting the why, which is probably more interesting and more important for you as a photographer to know, because everyone apparently has a different way of doing things. Only if you understand the why behind why, like only if you understand why they're doing something, would you be able to take away from their videos and actually apply that into what you're doing yourself. And so in this video, I am going to apparently run you through how I always start my editing process, but there will be a huge focus on explaining to you why I do certain things. So if that sounds interesting, let's dive right in. Okay, so we're now in Adobe Bridge, where I put all my photos, where I look at them, where I skim through them. I know that a lot of people use Lightroom, it's a really popular choice. I used to do that as well, but now I have decided that Adobe Bridge works better for me, and we will be editing in Adobe Camera Raw. The first thing that I do, this really has become second nature, is to fix the color profile of the image. By default, the software opens the file using the Adobe color profile, which should also be the case if you're using Lightroom. At this point, I always change it to Adobe Standard. That is a color profile that I base my edits on every single time, and I'll tell you why. So in the drop-down menu of the color profile section, you can see that Adobe has made a set of built-in color profiles for you to choose from. Just have a look at how the histogram looks like at the very top. That is how it looks for Adobe Color. When I change it to Adobe Standard, you can see that the photo becomes flatter. What that essentially means is that there's less of a contrast. The shadows, the blacks, they are lifted slightly, and the highlights and the whites, they're dropped slightly. So overall, the image would look less contrasty. Everything just looks more neutral. Apparently, Adobe Standard is the color profile that I go for every time, but we can also take some time to explore the other color profiles that Adobe has to offer. For example, Adobe Landscape. Adobe Landscape just makes the blues more saturated. It also adds more contrast, but it's more about color contrast. I think the rationale behind this is because when you're taking a photo of landscape, there is probably going to be a large portion that is blue. The skies are blue, waters, lakes, rivers, they're all blue. And also, there are a lot of greens usually. You're gonna have grass or greenery, trees and hills and mountains. That is the reason why when you use the Adobe Landscape color profile, the greens and the blues tend to be accentuated and the saturation tends to go up. Apparently, I'm not taking a landscape photo, but even if I am, right, I would feel like I want to do that myself. I don't want to start my editing process with a base of colors that is already very saturated. There's also Adobe Vivid, which I feel is an amalgamation between Adobe Color, which increases the brightness contrast, and Adobe Landscape, which increases the color contrast. So if you set it on Adobe Vivid, you end up with a photo that is both very contrasty in terms of brightness levels and color. Let's put it back to Adobe Standard. This is what I prefer to work on. Let me show you another example. So this is a photo that I shot in Malta, I think 2 years ago. This photo was shot during late afternoon where the sun was really harsh. And also if you've been to Malta, you would know that the building structures actually cast really sharp shadows. You know, there really is a very harsh transition between the highlights versus the shadows. That results in a really contrasty image per se. If we have this in Adobe Color, where the software automatically takes the highlights and make it brighter and takes the shadows and make it darker, it results in clipping before I even start editing the photo. I definitely do not want that to happen. As I toggle between Adobe Color and Adobe Standard, you can see that there's a surprising difference between how the highlights are performing. In the standard color profile, I retain more details in the highlights, which I could later work on. This might be a rather extreme example because the highlights are so strong and they are on the brink of blowing out, but this is generally a good practice because it allows you to make the most out of this software. One of the beauties of this software is the fact that you are able to make adjustments to the same quality of the image, here in this case the exposure, the brightness, using different tools without them interfering with each other. So whatever I do to the color profile does not affect the sliders in the basic tab. If you use this properly to your advantage, you will be able to get a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to tweak your photo, but it also creates problems if you don't use it properly, which is you will have a hard time finding out what exactly went wrong with your edit, because what you did to the color profile is not going to show up in the basic tab, it's not gonna show up in the tone curve section. So if you made some adjustments that you didn't like, or say it's unnecessary in this stage of the color profile settings, then you essentially have to use the sliders and other tools to undo that edit, which kind of defeats the purpose of having multi-layers or fronts of editing the photo with them being independent from each other. For me, I don't want to add anything artificial when it comes to the color profile because I want to retain full control. It also helps me gain the clarity of what is making what effect in my photo. After setting the color profile to what I want, which is Adobe Standard, the second thing that I always do is crop the photo. Well, specifically that also involves fixing the optical distortions and also the geometry, rotating and straightening the image. The reason why I always get the geometry and the cropping done before I actually make adjustments is because the cropping affects the exposure. Let's look at this example here, which is again a fairly contrasting lighting situation. Summer afternoon in Barcelona, I believe. And so you can see the light is casting into this valleyway from an angle, and that is why the end of it is under direct sunlight, whereas the two sides in the walls are left in the shadows without much light. It would be helpful for you to see what would happen if I reverse that order, right? What would happen if I make adjustments and then go back to crop the image? Most of the time when we're editing a photo, especially when it comes to exposure, what we're really doing is on an overall level. At least that's what I do. I make sure that on the histogram there is always absolute blacks and always absolute whites. So I make sure that there is a tiny bit of clipping, not too much, but I always want my photo to span through the entire range of zones because I think that looks the most natural to the human eye. When we have this uncropped image, apparently the tones are too concentrated towards the shadows, and that's why we've got to lift the shadows and open up the detail a bit more so that it wouldn't form too much of a contrast with the brighter parts, which is the sky and the windows in the middle, and also there are some bright parts in the wall in the upper right corner. When you take into account the sky as well, there is quite a huge part of highlights that are rather bright as compared to the entire photo. And so what you would do is to reduce the highlights a bit so that it makes more sense on a general level for this photo. And then you go back to crop the photo, right? So let's say I feel that there is too much of a sky here that isn't really doing much for the photo, and that I want it to be more symmetrical. So I want the windows to actually be in the center of the photo, and that's why I will be cropping in slightly. Now, when you look at this new frame, this new photo, it seems a bit flat all of a sudden, and when you actually look at the histogram on the upper right hand side, indeed, there is no absolute black point. As a result, I'll have to go back and decrease the black point to also decrease the shadow, so basically I'm doing what I was doing in the first place. And what's also interesting about this photo is that the edges of this photo was actually the darkest part. I'm not sure if it's entirely because of the vignetting of the lens. I mean, you can technically, of course, you can fix vignetting using Lightroom or Camera Raw. There is an option for you to fix vignetting, and you can also reverse it, but you can't totally do that 100%. And also another reason is that since the light is coming from the end of this walkway, that is why the parts that are the closest to the camera naturally are going to be the darkest. And when I'm cropping, I actually cropped out both the darkest and the brightest areas, and that is why the image is bound to turn out less contrasty and probably a bit too flat after I cropped it. This is not only a matter of efficiency and saving time. In more complex situations, this can actually lead to difficulty in identifying what went wrong in your photo, especially when you have other adjustments also in place. So that is why I always crop before I make my lighting, my brightness adjustments. Here is another example, which is also a photo that I took in Barcelona, this time in the morning. The situation here here is that there is a lot of highlights in the sky. On the top part of the frame, there are a lot of shadows in the walls because it's also a backlit situation where the light comes from. This way, I'm shooting into the streets from the opposite end, and that's why these walls don't get as much sunlight except for this part of the ground, and that's the reason why I took this photo. Again, this is a highly contrasted situation in terms of lighting. If I just jump right in without cropping and I start messing with the brightness sliders, because it's shot backlit, the shadow areas can be a bit muddled, and that's why I want to go back in and add some black just to make sure that there are absolute black points in the image. So apparently with this photo, I would like to reduce the highlights and also the whites because there is too much of that in the sky. Okay, so let's say now for composition reasons, I want to go back and crop the image. So as you can see, almost the entire sky has been cropped off, and also some of the edges of the photo has been cropped off. And now we end up with a grossly underexposed image. This part is still relatively brighter than the rest, but it's not an absolute white because the absolute white was in the sky when the photo was edited as an overall, and now when we look into only part of the frame, there are no absolute whites, and that's why I had to go back and add back more whites. So hopefully these two examples demonstrate to you why it makes sense to crop your images properly, make sure that you're looking at the right frame before you actually start editing. After the color profile correction and cropping, the third thing that I always do before I do any adjustments is to remove color cast and, well, in more general terms, fix the white balance. For example, here is an image that I took in Florence, Italy during nighttime. So the scene was only lit with this yellowish street lamps, but I still really wanted to take a picture because this person, who is a handicraftsman sitting on the floor selling his art, looks really interesting. And so despite the fact that the lighting is a bit off, I still took the shot. And with this photo, I'm gonna demonstrate why it's so important to fix this color cast, and even if it's not a color cast, just to fix the white balance in general before you actually tap into the other adjustments. So if you just look at the histogram from the top right corner, there are 3 primary color channels that make up every single photo. That is blue, green, and red. So in order for there to be an absolute white point in a photo, there has to be a pixel in the image in which all 3 of these primary colors reach the required level of brightness of a white point, if that makes sense. So what happens when you have a color cast, right? So let's say in this image where the pixels are predominantly yellow, as a result there aren't enough blues, there aren't enough reds, and when you try to pull up the white slider, right, what the software does is that it increases the brightness of these pixels until it finds a point at which all 3 channels exhibit a bright point. But because this image is so tinted towards the yellows and it's so lacking in blues and greens, that is why in order for that to happen, the image will have to be brightened by an exaggerated amount, which looks like a burnt image, basically. And so in order to counteract this craziness, I'll have to add more blacks, I'll have to reduce the exposure, I'll have to reduce the highlights and do a lot of things just to compensate for that. Let's say I then remember that, okay, my white balance is apparently off. Let's go back to adjust that first. I reduce the temperature and I also increase the magentas in the photo. And then you realize that it actually frees up so much room in the white sliders, and you don't actually need to go so extreme with the values on these sliders. If that's the route I take, it actually throws me off my rationale of why I adjust a certain slider as opposed to the other. It just adds so much complication into the process. So the adjustments that I'm doing in order to undo what I had done started to get a bit arbitrary because honestly there's no simple way to delineate what I was doing from the white balance adjustments. And because white balance is something that you have to fix anyway sooner or later, why don't you fix that in the beginning so that you can have more of a method instead of madness when it comes to adjusting the brightness to make sure that your photo is decently exposed. Again, that was quite an exaggerated example because there was a color cast in the photo, but even if there wasn't, still color is such a fluid thing. It's amazing how just shooting at a different time of a day would change how color reflects in your image. Let's go back to this example where the image was shot during late afternoon, and that's why the tones are going to be relatively warm. As I toggle the temperature slider between the coolest tones and the warmest tones, you can see from the histogram clearly what that is doing to my photo. It is changing the contrast levels of my photo without me necessarily noticing it with my bare eyes. Oh, whoa, so you're still here. I'm seriously very impressed. Thanks so much for sticking around, and if you're looking for a more structured way of looking into my photo editing routine, I actually made an article about how I go about every single genre of photos that I manage. in a blog post. So I'm gonna link that in my description box below as well if you do things differently, which you probably do, and why. So what is the rationale behind what you do, right? So if there is anything you want me to know, definitely leave it in the comments down below. If not, I'll see you in the next video. Bye! You know, in today's day and age, we are provided with so many different softwares out there that are of equally high quality, and even within one single software, as we have just seen in Adobe Camera Raw, we are given with such a wide array of tools that help us do the same thing using different methods. And that is why we are able to make such intricate and precise adjustments, because each of these tools don't interfere with each other. And because of this amount of freedom that it gives us, photo editing has become something that we perceive as if we could just do whatever we want. Like, we don't really need any reason as to what we do. When in fact, this is quite a bold statement to make, but I do believe that there are one set of best practices when it comes to photo editing. Everything that you do should be justified by a reason behind. This is a hypothesis of mine. I'm by no means not even close to arriving at one logical conclusion, but I do have bits and pieces and fragmented concepts as to what are the best practices in terms of photo editing. So this video is an example of that in relation to how you should always start your photo editing process. And I also ended up actually pulling the highlights. Is it pulling? Is pulling? Or should it be pushing? This is something that I need to check. Pushing or pulling film is when you rate your film at a different speed from the one written or on the box. Then you compensate for a difference when you develop it. I don't think that's an applicable concept here. Anyway.